Hey, good evening, everyone. We wanted to welcome everyone and thanks everybody for joining us today. Um, I know it's been a serious topic of discussion for the Wedgewood school community, so we're delighted that we could have our meeting tonight and talk about potential solutions. Want to thank the entire planning department team for all the work they've put in. I particularly want to mention planner Nicole Chi, who couldn't be with us tonight, but she worked very hard. And this is really the culmination of 10, 12 people getting together and talking about all the possibilities. And at the end, everyone arriving at the same place on what's being presented tonight. So when you're doing group work, you really like for that to be the conclusion at the end. So I'm welcoming everyone, and I hope that you like what you hear. We're encouraged with what's going to be presented. I'm now going to pass it to Superintendent Ali Jahangir for the land acknowledgement, introductions, and he'll share the meeting norms. So Ali?
Thank you very much. I'm having a slight technical difficulty, so I do apologize, but if you can hear me, I'm going to invite anyone who is able to stand to please stand for the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas, of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Thank you, Miigwech. Please be seated. Mr. Costello, I'm just not able to see anybody else on the screen right now, so just wanted to alert you to that, but I will move forward as best I can. So if we can just have the pleasure again to reintroduce our trustee for Ward 2, Trustee Dan McLean, myself, Ali Jahangir, the Superintendent for Learning Network 1. I have the pleasure of introducing three principals who are with us here tonight. Barbara Graydon, principal of Wedgewood Junior School. David Kassar, principal of West Glen Junior School. Anna Patterson, principal at Blurley Middle School. And members of our planning team, Dan Castaldo, Giovanna DiGiamo, and David Palster. And these are members of the TDSP planning department. And as you heard from our trustee, Nicole Chi, who was very instrumental in this process, but could not be with us here this evening. Our agenda includes an opening remark from our trustee. I will then go over how to participate in the Zoom webinar and also the virtual meeting norms. As you heard, please know that this is being recorded, but it is only for internal note-taking purposes. We will then proceed with the purpose of the meeting as well as some of the background by our planning department, proposed accommodation solutions, timelines and next steps, and then we'll really open this up for our community to provide feedback, questions, and answers, and we'll provide answers as best we can with a wrap-up at the end. You are able to connect with us through both your computers. So if you'd like to text, the instructions are there. You can click the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, then type your question in the window. To speak, we ask that you please use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, and the moderator will notify when you can speak. You can also use the telephone to speak. Press *9 to request to raise your hand. When the moderator announces your turn, please dial *6 to unmute yourself. There's also the QR code that you see is a detailed Zoom instruction for you. I'll take a few minutes to please go over the virtual meeting norms. All participants of virtual public information meetings are expected to maintain meeting decorum and abide by the requirements of the Board Code of Conduct, PR 585, and the Code of Online Conduct, PR 571. Discrimination and harassment will not be tolerated. Please be concise, respectful, and courteous with your comments and questions. To ensure that everyone has an opportunity to speak, please make one comment or ask one question. If you have more comments or questions, please raise your hand again or type your question in the Q&A box. We'd appreciate that so everybody's voices are honored and heard. If you choose to speak, please minimize background audio. Trustee McLean, are there any other further opening remarks you'd like to provide?
Thank you, Superintendent Jahingar. No, I think we're good to pass it to Senior Manager Castaldo.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ali and Trustee McLean. And once again, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Over the next few slides, what I will do is review the background information and put into context the current accommodation issues at Wedgewood Junior School. I'll describe the recommendations to address those issues, and then I'll conclude by describing what our next steps are in this process. So next slide, please. So as you've heard, Wedgewood Junior School is experiencing accommodation pressure, and that's due to their enrollment growth. The school is currently operating above its capacity. It's got a utilization rate of 134%. And the utilization rate, it's a measure that we use, and it's simply the school's enrollment divided by its capacity. So to address the over-enrollment at the school, there are currently portables on site. And portables are a tool used by school boards right across the province to manage the ebb and flow of enrollment within a school community. We have over 500 of them in use right across the TDSB. And right now there's 7 portables on site at Wedgewood for this current school year. 5 of those are currently in use for instruction. The additional 2 portables are there to buffer against further enrollment increases should they occur in the near future. And a big factor in the enrollment growth at Wedgewood, it's related to the large amount of new residential development within the area. We are currently tracking around 18,000 new residential units in the pipeline within the boundary of the school, which is a very large amount. And we fully recognize and acknowledge that we need a new school in this area to meet the long-term requirements of this growing community. And to that end, we did submit a business case to the Ministry of Education early last month for a new school on the Silver Hill site, which is just south of Wedgewood Junior School. You may be familiar with the site. It's the current home of Etobicoke Secondary Alternative School. And just so everybody's aware, the board doesn't have the autonomy to build new schools whenever it wishes to. All of the funding for new schools or additions to existing schools, it's allocated by the province through an annual process called the Capital Priorities Program. And that's where all 72 school boards across the province submit business cases for their most urgent accommodation needs. And for this year, the new school on the Silver Hill site was one of our top 5 most urgent projects that we have submitted. So we're hoping for an approval from the Ministry of Budget and expecting to hear news on that late in March or early in April of next year. But there's no guarantees. Just because we've made the case for a new school doesn't necessarily mean that the province will provide funding for it. And even if they do, it does take a considerable amount of time to get a school built in the city of Toronto. Some of our recent projects have taken approximately 5 years to construct. So considering that, we need to implement an accommodation plan now that addresses the pressures at Wedgewood Junior School, and that's what we're here to present to you this evening. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we're showing the enrollment at Wedgewood, and on the left-hand side of the table, we're looking at the actual enrollment from 2021 to 2023. And then from 2024 on, we're looking at the projected enrollment for the school. And what we see here is a significant jump in enrollment between 2021 and 2023. Enrollment at the school grew by around 100 students, which is quite significant. There are currently 585 students enrolled at the school, and the building has a capacity of only 438 pupil places. And as we move forward into those future years, you can see that enrollment is projected to continue to increase, particularly after 2027. And that's when a lot of those new developments in the area are expected to begin to occupy. We'll start to see new students entering Wedgewood as those new dwellings are completed. The utilization rate, it's shown in the second row here, and we can see the current rate at 134% and its projected growth all the way to 190% by 2030 if no changes are made. The number of portables is in the third row, and we can see how that is growing as well, all the way up to 16 portables that could be required on the site by 2030. And the school simply can't accommodate that. We feel that the site and the school has reached its limit in terms of the number of students and portables that are already there. And that's led us to explore ways to bring down enrollment at the school. And last point on this slide, we know that enrollment will continue to grow after 2030. Many of those large developments that are expected to begin to occupy at or around 2027, they'll take years to reach full completion. So the figures that we're looking at right now don't necessarily reflect the peak of the enrollment growth. Next slide, please. So as we've noted, there does need to be some form of intervention made to address the pressures at Wedgewood. And we have explored some of what I would call operational changes along the way. The school has been closed to out-of-area admissions for 10 years. And that means that no students residing outside of the school's boundary have been permitted to attend. There have been portables added to the site year over year to accommodate the growth in enrollment. And unfortunately, we don't have any opportunities to relocate programs or other user groups at this school. In other words, we can't simply relocate a French program or another TDSB function like continuing education. And the building itself doesn't offer us any opportunities to retrofit or renovate areas to create new classroom space. An example of that would be a large library that could be subdivided to create a new classroom. But all of the ancillary spaces at the school are quite small. And because all of those options have been exhausted, we added a study to our long-term program and accommodation strategy to explore other changes for Wedgewood to mitigate the pressures that exist. And we refer to the long-term program and accommodation strategy as our LTPAS. And that's essentially a collection of studies that we will undertake over the next 10 years to address issues, gaps, and needs at schools right across the city. It's a document that we produce every year. It's approved by our board, and it is publicly available on our website. Next slide, please. So this study began by forming a local feasibility team, or an LFT, and that's an internal group that includes the local trustee, superintendent, the principals, and central staff. And the mandate of that team is to identify and evaluate potential solutions to an accommodation issue. And this team discussed a few possible solutions for Wedgewood, and they included the redirection of new residential development. And that's a process where future residential dwellings are assigned to other schools, often further afield, that may have space available, or at the very least, their sites are large enough to accommodate portables. The team also discussed boundary changes, and that's slightly different. That's when existing addresses are shifted from one school to another to balance enrollment. Grade changes were also discussed, and that's where a grade or grades could be relocated from a school as a way to reduce enrollment. And what we're here to share with you tonight is our recommendation. And it involves the first two, the redirection of residential development and a boundary change. Grade changes were not recommended by the team. Next slide, please. So we'll get into the proposed solution now. And we're going to start with the first component of it, which is the redirection of new residential development. So we're proposing that all new residential development within the Wedgewood attendance area be temporarily assigned to schools outside of the area. And that effectively means that no new development will be accommodated at Wedgewood until there is space available to accommodate it. But occupancy of these large developments, it's not imminent. Many of those larger developments will take some years to complete. So we have to endeavor to identify those holding schools as occupancy gets closer. We haven't determined at this point exactly what development will go to what school. All of that will be determined later. And we have this situation in other parts of the board where we're into this perpetual rolling state of development redirections. It's in place in areas like Midtown, also along the Young Shepherd corridor. So we're going to reflect the study in our long-term program and accommodation strategy to ensure that it is part of our annual and approved work plan, and we'll monitor every one of those developments to ensure that those decisions are made at the appropriate time. And that's a measure that's going to reduce the long-term enrollment pressure at Wedgewood, but something is still required to address the current pressure at the school. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, we have a map of the residential development in the area. The developments are shown by the beige polygons and the school's attendance area by the red lines. And we see that most of the development activity is happening south of Bloor Street, particularly along Dundas Street West. And why is all that development happening? The answer to that question is also shown here. So the red area on the map, that's an urban growth center. And that's designated as such by the province and by the city. And these are where a very high degree of intensification is encouraged. And we are certainly seeing that now. The beige area to the west, that is considered an avenue under the city's official plan. And that's another area where intensification is encouraged. We also see the Silver Hill site on the map. Here it's labeled as Etobicoke Secondary Alternative School, and that would be the location for the future elementary school. And we can see that it's nicely situated in proximity to all of that new growth. Next slide, please. So this is the impact of the residential development redirections on enrollment at Wedgewood. The table at the top in blue, that represents the current situation, and that's the same information that we had just looked at a few slides ago. Below that in green, that's the table that reflects all new residential development being redirected away from Wedgewood. And we can see that enrollment at the school is essentially held at or around where it currently is, with some degree of fluctuation. But the number of portables required doesn't exceed the 7 that are currently on site. But there is no reduction in enrollment, and we can see that as well, especially in the near term. And that leads us into the second component of the accommodation recommendation, which is the boundary change. So we're proposing that the boundary change be implemented to shift a portion of Wedgewood's attendance area to West Glen Junior School, which is in close proximity to Wedgewood, located just north of Burnham Thorpe Road. We're also recommending that the boundary change be implemented for September 2024. And that's to ensure that Wedgewood enrollment, at Wedgewood, begins to ease as soon as possible. So effectively what that means is that anyone new to the TDSB enrolling for September of 2024 residing in this area would be assigned to West Glen. There's space available at West Glen, and we'll see those enrollment figures in just a second. The site is also large at nearly 6.5 acres, and it could accommodate portables should they be required in the future. And although we are recommending that the boundary change be implemented as soon as possible, we're not recommending that any current Wedgewood students be moved. All current students at the school would be able to continue. Next slide, please. So here is a map of the proposed boundary change. The area that we are speaking about extends south of Burnham Thorpe Road, west of the East Mall, and north of Bloor Street. Specifically, that would include all addresses on Formula Court, Gibbs Road, Valhalla Inn Road, and from 300 to 396, the East Mall. And again, we would be phasing in this change. Only new registrants would be required to attend West Glen. There would be no changes to the middle or secondary school pathways. Students would rejoin their peers at Bloor Lee Middle School for grade 6 and then proceed on to secondary school. Next slide, please. So here's the impact of the boundary change on enrollment at Wedgewood. The table at the top in green, that's the same table that we had just looked at that reflects the redirection of residential development away from the school. The table at the bottom in orange, that reflects the impacts of the proposed boundary change. So in 2024, the year of implementation, enrollment at the school is projected to be 572 students, compared with 598 students without the boundary change. And from there, enrollment will continue to decline as the change is phased in. And this model suggests that by 2029, enrollment could decrease below 500 students, potentially only requiring one portable on the site. And the change would fully be implemented by 2030. And what I mean by that is the first cohort of junior kindergarten students that could be impacted next year, they would have reached grade 5 by 2030. Next slide, please. So here's the same information for West Glen, just so we can see and understand what the impact on that school may be. The current situation at West Glen, it's reflected in the first table above in blue, and we can see that the school is currently operating at 75% utilization with 163 students. The West Glen building, it's smaller than Wedgewood's. They have a capacity of 217 pupil places. And the projection for the school suggests some growth, particularly after 2027, which is when proposed development in the West Glen attendance area is expected to begin to occupy. And they may require one portable in the distant future if the projection for the school holds through to that time. So the impact of the boundary change, it's shown in the bottom table in orange. And in 2024, we see that enrollment at the school would be 187 students, which is an increase over the status quo projection of 171 students for next school year. So effectively, by implementing this change, we could be moving between 20 and 25 students each year as the change is phased in. From there, enrollment at the school will continue to grow, reaching potentially 321 students by 2030 when it's fully implemented. And the school may require up to 3 portables to accommodate that projected enrollment increase, but we'll talk about some options to potentially mitigate that need in just a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we've seen the impact of the proposed changes on the schools involved, what I'll describe now are a few other considerations associated with the proposed boundary change, starting with French programs. So the area that's proposed to be included within West Glen's boundary would be associated with the early French immersion program at Broadacres Junior School, which aligns with the current association for West Glen. Wedgewood would continue to be associated with Middlewood Junior School. There would be no changes to the pathway for the French program. Both would enter Bluedale Middle School at grade 6 and then proceed on to Richview at the secondary level. The Middle Immersion Program Association wouldn't change. Both schools are associated with Briarcrest Junior School. And as you've heard, we are recommending that no current Wedgewood student be moved and that all would be allowed to stay at the school. But we are recommending that no legacy permissions be extended to siblings of existing students. And that means that all new registrants within that proposed boundary change area, regardless of whether they have an older sibling attending Wedgewood, they would all be required to attend West Glen. And again, that's to ensure that there is a measurable impact on enrollment at Wedgewood as soon as possible. That said, if there were a current Wedgewood student that would like to move to West Glen to attend there with their younger sibling, then that would certainly be possible. In terms of before and after school programs, there's not currently a traditional program at West Glen Junior School. There hasn't been sufficient demand to date to necessitate that, but there are similar services that are offered there. There's an aftercare program from Monday to Thursday. There's also an early on program at the school. But that said, there will be a survey of the West Glen community in February of next year. And that's to determine if there is, again, sufficient demand for a before and after school program. And if there is demand, then one would be offered. And it could be the case that the additional enrollment at the school through the boundary change results in sufficient demand for a program. And that could also potentially reduce the waiting list for the program at Wedgewood. So there is a before and after school program at Wedgewood. It's approximately 3 years long. So in other words, there may be benefits for both schools as a result of this proposed change when it comes to before and after care. Next slide, please. So as I alluded to earlier, if accommodation issues do arise at West Glen, as a result of the changes that we are proposing and portables begin to be accrued there, then we do have a couple of options to mitigate that. There are regional programs at the school that we could look at relocating to free up classrooms in the building. And we could also look at redirecting new residential development in the West Glen area to other schools. And that would be another way to mitigate enrollment growth at the school. So when we looked at the status quo for Wedgewood, saw there was space, and we looked at the projected enrollment inclusive of the boundary change and potentially 3 portables being required, there's options for us to bring that enrollment down to a point where potentially no portables would be required. In terms of transportation, there are some addresses in the proposed boundary change area that are currently bused to Wedgewood. However, if this boundary change is approved, then many of those addresses would now be within walking distance to West Glen. There are still some addresses within that boundary change area that would continue to receive busing, and those addresses are those along Gibbs Road at the southern end of that proposed boundary change area. And lastly, this is an important point also. If we are successful in receiving a grant to construct the new elementary school, then we're going to be back through a very similar process again. We're going to need to determine a boundary for that new school, which means we'll be revisiting the boundaries for all of the schools that surround it. So the changes that we're talking about tonight, those are a way to mitigate the enrollment growth and achieve a better balance across these 2 schools specifically. in that interim period, but there could be changes in the future that would result in a completely different arrangement of school boundaries at that time. And we'll also be looking to return any residential developments that have been redirected to schools outside of the area to provide those students and those families with a local elementary school. Next slide, please. So just to recap the proposed solution very briefly, there are two parts to it. The first, again, is to redirect new development within the Wedgewood area to other schools, and we'll be implementing those redirections as those developments get closer to completion. The second part is the boundary change with West Glen. And again, that would be implemented for September 2024. It would impact only new registrants residing in that boundary change area. It would not impact any current Wedgewood students. If that boundary change is approved, then we will closely monitor enrollment at both schools. And of course, we will engage in further action if it is required. And we're going to continue to advocate for that new school that we all know is very much needed to meet the long-term needs of this community. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. You may need some time to reflect on it, to digest a little bit. So I wanted to share that the meeting tonight, it's not the only opportunity to provide feedback or to ask questions. We do have a survey open now on the webpage for this review. So I would strongly encourage you to fill out that survey. It's going to allow us to quantify some of the thoughts and opinions about the proposal, and we'll be including that information in our report to the Board of Trustees. You can continue to submit your comments or your questions to the accommodation reviews email as well. We've been compiling a frequently asked questions document, and that's now available on our website. And we're going to continue to add responses to the document as questions come in. We'll also do our best to provide responses to any questions that we're not able to respond to tonight. So if you do have questions, please be sure to get them into the chat so that we have a record of them and that we're able to respond to them. We're going to be presenting our recommendations to the board's Planning and Priorities Committee on January 25th, 2024. And that will be an opportunity for you to provide your thoughts and comments to members of the board. You can do so in writing, or you can sign up to speak directly to them at the meeting. There's a link here with all of the details on how to make a delegation. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide for me this evening. It's just touching on some of our next steps. So following the meeting this evening, the local feasibility team, we're going to reconvene likely in a week or two to allow some time for the survey to be completed, for questions to be answered. And at that meeting, we'll be reflecting on the feedback that we have received, and we will be finalizing our recommendations to the Board of Trustees. And again, we're going to be presenting that report to the Planning and Priorities Committee on January 25th, and that would be the time where members of the public are able to make delegations, to make their thoughts known directly to trustees. And that final decision of the board, it's going to be made on January 31st, which is about a week after the Planning and Priorities Committee. And once that decision is made, we will be notifying all of the impacted school communities of the change, and that's typically done through a letter from the local superintendent. We'll also be posting that letter online along with the minutes of the board meeting that outline the decision that has been made. So thank you once again, everybody. Really do appreciate your time. And now I will hand the floor back to Ali to lead us in the next part of the meeting.
On that note, I'm aware we have just a few last minutes left. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our trustee, to thank our administrators, to thank the great work that our planning team has done, many hours of thinking and putting together different options. Thank our community members, most importantly, for their feedback, their input. And I also want to recognize Mr. James Jarrett, who is the admin liaison. He's waving at us right now for Learning Network 6 for supporting us tonight with minutes. Thank you very much, sir. Also, again, just wanted to recognize in her absence, one of our planners, Ms. Nicole Chi, who also was instrumental in putting together many of the pieces to our conversation tonight. I see a thank you note. We'll receive that gratefully. Thank you for the informative session, as well as for making it 2 hours to ask questions and provide comments. It is our sincere pleasure. We appreciate everyone's feedback, the rich questions that you shared, and Trustee McLean, did you want to just any closing thoughts before we bring the meeting to a close?
Thank you, Superintendent Shahingar. We really appreciate the feedback, and we're hearing, and change is difficult. We knew when we undertook this process that this is always a difficult, challenging, when you start cutting up catchment areas, there's always challenges, and changes that some people aren't excited about. So we really appreciate people filling out the surveys and all the feedback we can get before the final document is set, to go before the board at the January 24th day at PNP. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for staff.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a very good evening.